So your sum and difference formulas can be used with degrees as well. You can write this on page 651. It's a blank page is where we started. This is part B. So you see 75 degrees. You have to think of two angles that are on your unit circle that add up to 75 degrees or subtract, but 45 and 30 works really nice. 45 becomes your alpha, 30 degrees becomes your beta. And you can do sine alpha, cos beta plus cos alpha sine beta. And I had you try this so you get all those values and you get exactly the same values as you did for part A. And for the pi over 12 family, for sine and for cosine, you will always get a root 6. You will always get a root 2, and you will always have it over 4. What will change is sometimes things will be positive and sometimes things will be negative. So the next one, the first ones we did was 75 degrees. It was really easy to see 45 plus 30. And the very first one we did with pi over 12, if you thought about pi over 3, pi over 4, and pi over 6, it was pretty easy for us to see 4 pi over 12 minus 3 pi over 12 would make 1 pi over 12. But now we're going to go into some that are a little bit bigger in numbers. So find the exact value of cos of 17 pi over 12. And before we actually go into doing this, I'm going to tell you that using your values on your pi plate, there's an infinite number of ways to add or subtract that work that give you 17 pi over 12. Now we don't have an infinite amount of people in here, but I want you each to come up with a different one. So the easy one's up for grabs. First person that gets the easy one, whichever one that is. Right? You want to figure out what 17 pi over 12 is equal to using two things on your pi plate. Once you've found one, call me over and I'll check it and I'll put it up on the board. There's an infinite amount of right answers. We've got 5 up there so far. This can be the part of the question that could take you a while because we're asked to find cos of 17 pi over 12. The finding two things that add or subtract to 17 pi over 12 could take you a while unless we notice a pattern. We've only done 5 up here so far, but do you know something in common in all of them? What's in common in all of them? They all have a pi over 4. Do you see that? This one has 3 pi over 4. This one has 5 pi over 4. This one has pi over 4. This one has 7 pi over 4. This one has pi over 4 with a minus. The reason that happens is because when you make these over 12, like the first one, the green one, can you see that this is 8 pi over 12 plus 9 pi over 12? And the second one would be 15 pi over 12 plus 2 pi over 12. The third one is going to be 14 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12. The pi over 4 family, when you make it over 12, is always going to be an odd number. And if you need two things to add or subtract to an odd number, one of them has to be odd, one of them has to be even. And so yesterday when you were writing your notes, I had written down pi over 3, pi over 4, and pi over 6 family, and above it in red I had written which ones were even and which ones were odd. So what that means is you could choose, if you were trying to figure out another one for 17 pi over 12. 17 pi over 12 is equal to, well, you could choose any pi over 4 family that exists. What's a pi over 4 we haven't counted? We've got pi over 4 already. We've got it positive and negative. Do we have 3 pi over 4? We do positive. Do you want to use 3 pi over 4 negative? Okay. So you could start with negative 3 pi over 4. This is one that normally you don't start with, but you could. Now, negative 3 pi over 4 is equal to negative 9 pi over 12. What would you have to add to this to make 17? 26. And if you reduce 26, sure enough, every single time it will be something else on your unit circle. 13 pi over 6 is on your unit circle. So what do people normally do? Well, they don't start with negative 3 pi over 4. They say, if I'm trying to find, let's do a new one that we haven't done yet, 23 pi over 12. If I'm trying to find something that adds up to 23 pi over 12, I choose a pi over 4, either that I think it's close, or some people just choose plain old pi over 4. If you choose pi over 4, well, that's equal to 3 pi over 12. What would you have to add to get to 23? 20 pi over 12. And when you reduce that, can you see that that reduces nicely to 5 pi over 3, which is on your pi plate? Yes?
For 13 pi over 6, that becomes a mixed fraction.
It's coterminal with pi over 6.
But what if, because I remember we had this conversation, why can't I use 1/2 pi over 6 and pi over 12? And then say...
Well, because what's going to happen, we're going to get to this question right now. So we've got, find the exact value of cos of 17 pi over 12. Okay? We're going to choose two of the answers. The one I have here, right, you can pick any of those. I happen to choose 21 pi over 4 minus 4 pi over 12, which is equal to cos of 7 pi over 4 minus pi over 3. You want your alpha and beta to be ones that are on your unit circle, because the next step in figuring this out is to expand this, and you want those to be values you can figure out quickly. If you had pi over 12 in there, but if you have 1/2 pi over 6 in here, which is pi over 12, you still don't have that value easy. Whereas cos of 7 pi over 4, I know it's root 2 over 2. Can I move it down, or is that too quick? Not yet? You go to your unit circle, figure out all of those values, make sure you check what quadrants there are, and make sure you get the positive and negatives correct. And once again, you get a root 2, a root 6, and a 4, but this time there's a minus sign in between. Sometimes on the final exam, they have this question as part A, and then part B, they'll have something like this, secant of 17 pi over 12. Well, if you just figured out cos of 17 pi over 12, then secant of 17 pi over 12 will be the reciprocal, and you just take your answer and flip it. You wouldn't have to show any work. And the nice thing when they do this, and it's marked, if you totally screw up on the first part and get a wrong answer, your answer is like 1/2. If you flip 1/2 for part B, they give you the answer for carrying your mistake through. So that's kind of nice. I can scroll back up a bit. Up to there, fine?
Yep, thank you.
Try this one. What would you do with that 4 in front? Okay? So on the exam, a lot of people lost a lot of marks because that 4 in front scared them, and they left it blank. Don't let it scare you. In fact, ignore it for a little bit. If you ignore it for a little bit, can you figure out what cos of 11 pi over 12 is equal to? And whatever answer you get, what are you going to do with that 4? Multiply by 4 in the end. So start by figuring out what cos of 11 pi over 12 is. Figure out two things that add up to 11 pi over 12. Here is the solution for cos of 11 pi over 12. I figured out two things that added up to 11 pi over 12. I started with some pi over 4 family member. In this case, I just picked pi over 4. And then I said, well, pi over 4 is 3 pi over 12. What would add up to 11? 8 pi over 12. Reduce those, and sure enough, they're both on your unit circle. Use the correct formula for cos alpha plus beta. Made this my alpha, this my beta. Cos cos minus sine sine. Took those values from my pi plate, was careful about cos in quadrant 2 is negative, so that's why we get a negative a half there. Multiplied it out, wrote it as a single fraction. Now that we've found that, we can say, so 4 cos of 11 pi over 12 should equal 4 times this. Because this is what 11 pi over 12 was. And the 4's will simplify. And our final answer is negative root 2 minus root 6. Yes? No, it doesn't matter if the root 6 is first and root 2. And whatever you choose as your values, like I chose pi over 4 and 2 pi over 3, choosing different values might make the root 6 appear first and the root 2 after. Yes? No, you don't need to simplify that. In fact, you can't simplify that because you can't add radicals that aren't the same. Here, if you keep the brackets, you still have to simplify it because it's not a single fraction. If you distributed the 4 in the top and wrote negative 4 root 2 minus 4 root 6 all over 4, that would be fine. But in this case, it is easiest to see that those factors will cancel out and to simplify. Okay, so I gave you question 7, I think yesterday already, and some of you did it after the quiz. So I'll give that to you again if you haven't done so already.